tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. All right, so we started last week talking about the precepts in a general way, talked broadly about the precepts as initially a kind of renunciation. So you're letting go of following the impulse to act in ways that you know to be harmful to yourself and others. And the classical precepts are framed in the negative, refraining from taking life, refraining from stealing or taking that which isn't offered, refraining from sexual misconduct, refraining from lying, harsh speech, divisive speech, and useless speech, and refraining from abusing intoxicants, because doing so gives rise to carelessness or heedlessness, which makes you break the other precepts. And we talked a bit about their place in the Eightfold Path, where from the foundation of the path in wise view, right or wise view, sammaditthi, the first limb of the Eightfold Path, from our deep, mostly unconscious worldview, often transmitted to us culturally, but the sense that we have of how we live in the world, who we are, what the world means, from that deep worldview, there arises our intentions, again, many of which are unconscious, but which can be made conscious. And our intentions is really the first place we can act with agency. It's the first place we have leverage to begin to change our life. It's hard to change your worldview. You can do it. You study a lot and you practice and learn. And the Dhamma, being on the path with others, studying the teachings, part of the purpose of this is not just to work on meditation and become calmer, or work on your emotions and become more resilient or regulated, but is to work in a way indirectly on view. That as we deepen in awareness of our own process, awareness moment to moment of how things feel, the pleasant and unpleasant aspect of things, we really see the play of suffering and relief, grasping and letting go. An understanding of how the world works arises in us that begins to change our view. And so deeply held views that we may have been transmitted by the culture begin to fray and unwind as we practice. And as these views shift, as we start to let go of old ideas about separateness or isolatedness, or old ideas about the better, the superiority or inferiority of certain kinds of people or animals or beings over others, we start to wake up to the core views that the Buddha said are both true and powerful in changing our life, right? The core understanding of the world as constantly in flux, the understanding of impermanence, the understanding of the nature of ourselves as conscious manifestations of the complex system that this is, but not separate individual permanent beings in the way that some of us may have an intuition toward being or have been taught to be by soul-based cultures, immortality-based cultures. And so from the shift in view that the Dhamma brings about, our intentions begin to shift, conscious and unconscious. The classical intentions are, toward not causing harm, right? Toward generosity, toward kindness, toward non-cruelty, toward letting go, right? Renunciation is the first of the formal right intentions And as these new intentions come to the foreground in our life and become stronger, we are inspired to act differently. And so from view arises intention, from intention arises outward action, right? Choice, and then outward action. And choice is an interesting word here, because choice, or volition, in the Dhamma, cetanā is the Pali term for volition. Volition technically is a mental factor or an internal factor that precedes every kind of action, both conscious and unconscious. So often in English we use the word volition or intention mostly for conscious volitions, like I meant to do it. I'm lifting my hand on purpose. Cetanā, or formal volition in the Buddhist system, is understood to be more like the mobilization impulse that precedes action. And it can be unconscious. So there's a tiny little volition before you blink your eyes. And if you got really, really mindful, you would be able to discern a sequence of events that would track in the dependent origination style as something like, sensation at the eyes, dry, unpleasant, impulse to blink, to relieve the unpleasantness, blinking, relief, back to the beginning. And then you could notice that happening every however many seconds. And mostly we don't notice it, right? It just happens. But you can start to notice this when, as your mindfulness deepens, you get to bigger actions that are still unconscious. Like if you scratch an itch, you may find yourself scratching it without having thought that you were going to scratch it. It's just so habitual that there's sensation, contact, unpleasant vedana, right, the itch, craving, right, wishing that it would go away, and clinging, the actual action that makes it go away. And in the process of moving from craving to clinging, the volition arises to scratch the itch, and your hand goes there and scratches it. You didn't even notice you were doing it sometimes. And so if we play this out into bigger and bigger actions, you find yourself, walking across the house. I was headed to the backyard to, I don't know what, to have a little jump around in between, meetings, or to go see if there's any ripe plums on the tree, or to whatever, to go and have a pee. But halfway across the house, I find myself in front of the open refrigerator. How did I get there? Like there was a little blip of sensation, unpleasant, impulse to relieve the unpleasant sensation, go to the fridge, stare inside the fridge. And it may have been, that the contact that was unpleasant wasn't actually hunger. It might have been, say, boredom, or, or unhappiness, right? But in response to that contact, a volition arose, and I didn't catch the volition. So anytime we're working with, addictive states of the heart and mind, in many cases, if the addiction leads us to take action, this is what we're trying to become mindful of. Is we're trying to become mindful of the impulse that's leading toward a volitional action. And we want to bring that sensation, that intention or volition into awareness, rather than it continuing to be, unconscious or automatic or habitual. And so from wise intention, there blossoms the awareness in us that to resolve or disempower these forces in ourselves that are painful, harmful, unhealthy, we need to get a handle on our actions. And to do that, we need to get a handle on our intentions. And so the precepts themselves are reminders not to act in a specific set of harmful ways, killing beings, stealing, sexually misbehaving, lying, and misusing intoxicants. These are ways that we might act when, volition has, slipped away from mindful control and is, running on autopilot, reiterating old painful habits. So here comes the mosquito, I hear the whine, or I feel the little pinch, and there could be an old volitional twitch to slap, and it takes a kind of conscious intervention. It takes a shift in view where I really value the life of all tiny creatures differently, and then I give rise to the intention to let go of habitually taking life. And that intention has to become strong enough that when I feel that initial burst of unpleasant, contact and unpleasant Vedana, the whine of the mosquito's, wings, or the pinch on the skin, that I retrain my actions so that, I look and blow rather than slapping. And I have to interrupt an old volition to do that. So this is how we begin to work with all of the precepts initially, is we want to brighten our mindfulness and become aware of, what in like a somatic psychological framework we might call the prodromal, which is the sensation that precedes the actual symptom. So if the symptom is a headache, which I get, my prodromal is a little bit of tension in the back of the neck. It's not yet a headache, but it's the first sign that it's heading in that direction. If the symptom is the breaking of the precept, like slapping the mosquito, let's say, the prodromal is the intention that has a little bit of hatred in it, this kind of bright aversion, like get rid of it, And the prodromal to that, if we keep tracing it back, is the contact itself, is the Vedana, right? So this is all just part of basic mindfulness practice. We become more aware of that cycle so that we can interrupt it sooner. And so the reminder of the precepts are like a little alarm bell to teach us, these are the kinds of actions I want to avoid, and here's what I'm going to try to do. I'm going to try to catch it earlier in this cycle. So let's think about the first precept then in this model. Traditionally, it is to refrain from taking the life of any living creature. So some of the classic examples of this are attempting not to kill tiny insects. So to sweep up ants in the kitchen and take them outside on a dustpan rather than smashing them or spraying them, to blow off mosquitoes instead of instinctually hitting them. The deeper examples, for instance, are to not kill animals for food or clothing. And this opens up a complicated, or maybe not complicated, conversation in the modern system, where the precept traditionally refers only to actions that you specifically individually undertake. And so, it prohibits, for instance, taking life in order to eat, like going out and killing a chicken for your dinner. It doesn't prohibit buying the chicken that someone else killed or being gifted the chicken that someone else killed. And this probably has to do with both ways that the early monastic community survived. So for monks and nuns, it's actually much simpler. You take whatever food is offered, no matter what it is, because that's how the dana system works. So folks who are unfamiliar with the Buddhist understanding of monastic life are sometimes surprised that monks and nuns are not automatically vegetarian or vegan. If they were, they would be making a very different kind of demand on the lay people and the lay community that supports them. They would be having a very strong preference. And in some places, that would be an unsustainable preference. Like when I was a monk in Burma, and this other American monk and I, we wanted to buy a meal for the whole monastery, which is a couple hundred people, which was a common thing that lay supporters would do. And it was going to be a certain kind of amount. It was going to be like $100 to buy a meal for the whole monastery. That's like a couple hundred people. And I said, can we make it a vegetarian meal? Because I was, I've been vegetarian. I was vegetarian through that period. And they said, oh, you want to do that? That's very generous. That'll cost more like $150. So the vegetarian meal cost quite a bit more than a meat meal for the monastery. And so it was considered, kind of fancy in a certain way. And so the monastics don't make a practice of requesting, only vegetarian food or only vegan food, because that would change the relationship they have with the lay people into one of preference rather than a pure, open receiving. But as lay people, which most of us here are, we have a different realm of choice to make. Many of us feel that when we take on the precept, like the precept against killing, that it feels more right to us to understand that the ripple effects of our choices are also actions. So if I choose to buy meat, that, of course, indirectly, but kind of directly, causes the death of the animal, right? If there wasn't a market for a thing, it wouldn't be done. And so there are very much some modern teachers, modern lay Buddhist teachers, who have become strong advocates of veganism for this reason. My teachers Kittisaro and Tanisara speak beautifully on this. There's others who work with a different relationship to the felt understanding that all of our actions have a ripple effect out into the world. And we'll talk about this maybe a little more. Maybe we'll pin onto this a discussion of the fifth limb of the Eightfold Path, which is the limb of right livelihood, which is where I think our practice heads out into the wider economy. But like I practice, I love being vegetarian, and I have for 35 years or something, but I'm not vegan. And so I interact with the dairy of my local ecosystem, including the chickens that we have living here on the land, and local cows here in Sonoma County, which we're blessed to have very good local dairies. But I know how dairies work, and I know how egg farming works, and I know that there's death involved in those things. And my choice, and you can agree or disagree with it, but just for transparency, my choice in that is a common choice among some folks who, instead of hinging the precept specifically on the lives of beings, hinges it on ecosystem well-being. And I choose to eat locally rather than veganly, if that's a word, so as not to be relying on tropical nuts and foods shipped in from far away, particularly protein-intensive tree nuts, which have a whole different relationship to water and the watersheds. And it's debatable. I go back and forth. Sometimes I eat more in one way, sometimes more in another way. So I'm not going to preach to you about what you should do, but I think it's important to take on the precept in principle as a thing to help us be in a more vibrant, problematized relationship to our world and our economy. So there are so many ways where our actions indirectly take life or lead to both the degradation of life or the loss of life. And I think it's important for us to not be deluded about that. And the Buddha rejected, however, approaches to spiritual practice that were overly literal about karma and the taking of life. And particularly, he rejected the approach of the Jains, who are famously systematically vegetarian, but also extremely cautious, and really in some Jain systems have as the very center of their discipline the protecting of other beings like small insects from harm. So sweeping the path in front of you every time you walk so that you might not accidentally step on a small insect, or sweeping off the seat before you sit down in order to not sit on a small insect, or wearing a small piece of cardboard in front of the mouth. Masking saves lives, right? To not accidentally inhale an insect. And these are all beautiful renunciations, and you could totally practice them. And there are beautiful Jain traditions doing this. Now, the thing the Buddha was rejecting wasn't the practice per se of being that careful, but was the idea that you have to be that careful because if you should even accidentally kill a being, you would carry the karmic weight of that forward. And the Buddha said that's wrong. That's not how karma works. The Buddha's understanding of karma was that you carry the result of your intentional actions. And so a mistake is really different from an intentional action. Accidentally stepping on a bug and feeling bad about it, being like, oh my God, I didn't see you, sweetie, I'm so sorry. That has a very different result in the heart than, cruelly spraying the ants with Raid to get them out of your kitchen. Get out of here, you awful tiny creatures. You can feel the result in your heart differently. And so what I would encourage then with the precept against killing, and particularly in relation to how our actions affect the world through our economic activities, through what we eat or what we buy or the shoes we wear, or how we fly in a plane, or have a phone that buzzes, or anything that has such an impact on the world around us, is to be awake to the impacts of our actions and to the life and death impacts of our actions, and to know that there's no easy solution, because the temptation is to think that there's a solution that would promise us complete purity, that would somehow make us exempt from participation in the horror of an interconnected ecosystem. And the only thing that does that is the full liberation of the awakened being who's no longer reborn into suffering, no longer reborn into craving. Consciousness does something different than reanimating a body that will go through life with hunger and desire and interconnected actions that inevitably sometimes cause harm. So the only way out actually is enlightenment. There isn't a kind of ethical purity that will exempt us from our responsibility as beings on an interconnected planet and an interconnected ecosystem. And so if we think bigger about this first precept, okay, I'm taking on the precept of not taking life. There's the one layer that says, I'm going to be careful with the lives of beings around me, the small insects, the little beings, and again, don't go overboard with this. If you have to take antibiotics, and you're killing all the tiny bacteria, take the antibiotics if you have to, and then, if you've taken antibiotics and you've killed your gut microbiome, and then all this nasty bacteria shows up and you're kind of sick and you're recovering from antibiotics, which suck, and you eat a whole bunch of yogurt or whatever, kraut, kefir, and and you kill off all the nasty bacteria and you replant good bacteria. We're murdering tiny beings all the time. So, don't get verklempt about that. Like, it's more about bringing our awareness to actually not being separate from the ecosystem at all. So we're aware of that. We're not taking it to extremes, but we are, if you want to take it on, really practicing caring for the lives of the little beings around us. Going, further than that, there's looking at our livelihood and our actions so that we're not taking life casually. I don't have any dharmic justification for, like, if you were going to be a hunter, unless you were in a life or death or starvation situation. And in that case, I don't know, right? Maybe it's the same as one of those complex ecosystem moments where you say, I'm a participant in a very complex ecosystem. But the precept is not to take life. So you can take that literally, from small beings to large beings. And then you can take it economically, and you can really start to feel into how we relate to our impact on the larger world. And I think it's helpful to do so, whatever choice you make about the clothes you wear, the food you eat, how you travel, how you move through the world, how you spend your money, how you earn your money. Sometimes folks will take this first precept, we mentioned this a little bit last week, and they will abstract it from the literal not taking life into a much more general not causing harm. And I think that conflates this precept, which is, I think it has more punch if it is just about taking life. It conflates it with the broader teaching on harmlessness, which is Ahimsa in Sanskrit. That's the more commonly familiar version of the word, to Avihimsa in Pali, or Ahimsa in Spanish, and Avihimsa in Pali. And again, if you go far in that direction, you can reach both some very fruitful existential inquiry around what it is to live in this world where our actions have impacts everywhere. And it can become sometimes overbroad, because in a way, if the main thing that I'm reflecting on is how my actions, always have a kind of infinite impact, that can sometimes dilute the inquiry into the very specific actions that I have directly, relationally, with the beings close to me and around me. And it can become, not necessarily like bypass, but it's a different inquiry when it becomes that broad, that it's fully about non-harming. So my suggestion is to, yes, reflect on non-harming and hold that as a broad inquiry, but include the very specific inquiry of how we relate to life and living beings. And I just want to bow to probably the most, for some folks that I've known, the most difficult of the inquiries in relation to this first precept, which is abortion. And there are very strong views within the larger Buddhist community about how to think about terminating a pregnancy. And in the Theravada Buddhist system, traditionally, there is an understanding of life beginning, of life is everywhere, of this particular conscious life karmically starting at conception. When you do the practice of remembering your past lives, it seems to be possible for some people, when in doing that practice, to remember back to the first moment of arriving in the womb and the moment before that, one mind moment of transition, and then the moment before that being the moment of death. That's different in some other Buddhist systems, like the Tibetan system, where there's a 40-day or 49-day bardo of transition between bodies. In the Theravada system, it's kind of like dead, born, very sudden. And so some Theravada cultures have interpreted that as, the old consciousness arrives in the new body in the womb almost immediately. Therefore, abortion is taking life. Other traditions and other folks have interpreted it differently. When does that consciousness from the past life arrive in the fetus? Right away? 6 weeks, 12 weeks? There's not a deep technical abortion discussion in the Theravada world that I know of, outside of the kind of Western context, where it's, and really the US context, which is the only major country where it's hugely contentious and religious. So there's not a lot of traditional guidance on this, but you will find some very traditional Theravada teachers just saying that abortion breaks the first precept. For many of us, the question is not a technical one about rebirth and when consciousness arrives in a body, but is much more complex, dealing with the not self between mother and child, and the play of dukkha, and how we bring children into the world with an intention to give them the best possible conditions for well-being and liberation. And I know a lot of different practitioners who have come to, in themselves, an integration that makes sense both of the feminist and generally progressive view that a lot of Western Dharma folks share, and that I share, but that not everyone in the Western Dharma world shares, that is, definitely against forced birth and in favor of choice, and that choice, firmly being with the person who's bearing the child. But again, I just want to encourage just the inquiry into it. If it's something that troubles you or stirs anything up in you, to think about this precept in relation to, in relation to pregnancy and birth, then feel into it and spend time with it, and really let the way that the precept may really make sense to you and be inspiring or organizing in your intention and action and view, and let that come into presence with the complexity of the process of bringing children into the world, and the necessity sometimes of ending a pregnancy for whatever reason, and really just let it be present in you. And if for you it's a complete non-issue and you're like, dude, total non-issue, I know where I stand, great, this is brilliant, then stand there, So, but just opening it, because it is a place where there has been a fair amount, but not as much as there could be, of inquiry, I think, and conversation and deeper philosophical thought in the Buddhist world around this. So, anything else to finish here? Since we've been going kind of micro to larger, I'll just finish with the non-dual viewpoint, which is brought forward, for instance, in the translation of the precepts used in the Zen world. And the one that I know from my time in Rinzai Zen is the precept as phrased by the great Zen patriarch Bodhidharma. To not give rise to the mind of extinction is to keep the precept against killing. To not give rise to the mind of extinction is to keep the precept against killing. So at its subtlest, to kill is to bring one's mind to the conception that it would be possible for something to be killed at all. So to admit into one's consciousness the delusion of death or ending or extinction, right? That if everything is actually altogether one thing in a breathing, not separate ecosystem, and one life unfolds into the next life seamlessly, then what is it to kill? What is there to kill? Don't take that one toward bypass, nihilism, or the non-valuing of life. That's the great error. But if you can understand that from the depths of the infinite heart of compassion, then you have an approach to the precept that goes beyond our conventional understandings of birth and death. So we'll end there for now.